I'm running because we're in a time of crisis. I've been working on the climate issue for 30 years. We also are in an economic crisis, and we're in a political crisis. The Republicans are destroying our democracy. They're literally dismantling it.
But tonight I am here in Washington, D.C. because we are on government shutdown watch, and it looks like it is about 3 hours away. When President Obama was first elected in 2008, he, of course, came to Washington with something every president wants: a House and a Senate controlled by his own party. And in the 2 years where the Democrats had the White House, the House, and the Senate, we got Wall Street reform, student loan reform, credit card reform, health care reform, obviously, the Fair Pay Act, expanding of the GI Bill. They reauthorized the Children's Health Insurance Program. They expanded national service programs. They fixed the sentencing disparity for crack versus powdered cocaine. We got the 9/11 First Responders Bill. We got the Hate Crimes Act. They ratified the START Treaty between us and Russia on nuclear weapons. They repealed Don't Ask, Don't Tell. They did cash for clunkers. They did the stimulus, which included the largest middle-class tax cuts ever. That was all done by the Congress that was elected at the same time as President Obama in 2008. They were elected in November 2008. They were sworn in January 2009. And over the next 2 years, they got all of those things done. Then the Republicans did really well in the midterms, and the Republicans took control of the House for the first time in years, and John Boehner became Speaker. And since then, there has not been a single significant piece of legislation enacted into law. There have been a couple of trade bills. There was a bill that seemed to be inspired by a 60 Minutes segment about whether or not members of Congress get insider trading tips in the course of their doing business in Congress. But yeah, nothing. No significant legislation since John Boehner got the speakership. The Republicans won the elections in November 2010. They were sworn in January 2011. Since then, zero, zip, nothing in terms of legislative accomplishment. And that, of course, is because they have been otherwise occupied. After getting sworn in January, by April, they threatened to shut down the government. That was April. By July, Republicans had forced the first ever debt ceiling crisis in American history. We got our national credit rating downgraded for that one before they eventually blinked and decided they didn't want to keep going. By September of that same year, Republicans were again threatening another government shutdown. By April of the following year, more threats from Republicans of another government shutdown. By December, by this past December, Happy New Year, Republicans were pushing us over the fiscal cliff. By January, this past January, congressional Republicans were talking about forcing another debt ceiling crisis before again backing down. And now, happy September 30th. We are due for that often threatened Republican shutdown before tonight is through. This is not an accident that just keeps happening over and over again. Republicans control one half of one branch of government, and they have never had any plan to use that control to pass anything into law. If they had had that kind of plan, they might have passed something into law. But they haven't even seriously tried. We are deep into year 3 of them running the House now, and we've got zip from them in terms of law or policy. And we're at 7 and counting when it comes to can't keep the lights on failures of basic governance. And that is just as they planned it. In September 2010, just a few weeks before the midterm elections where the House Republicans won their majority and won back control of the House, a Republican congressman from Georgia, Lynn Westmoreland, he spoke to a conservative audience at a Christian Coalition event, the Faith and Freedom Conference. And he exhorted that conservative crowd that the Republicans were going to need their support when they moved to shut down the government. Again, this is ahead of the election. They were already planning on shutting down the government even before they got elected that November. Congressman Westmoreland said Republicans were going to do it again this time, just like they did the last time they took power in the House after the 1994 elections. Now, the audio here is a little sketchy, but lucky we had a transcript. So check this out.
He can tell you what happened. The government shut down. And the American people, that's why I wanted to hear it. If we hold the line, if we can get those courageous men and women to be part of our majority, and we say, look, we're in partnership with the American people. We're listening to the American people. This is what we're going to do. And the government shuts down.
We need to make sure that you are going to be with us when we shut down the government, which we will do if we win the majority this year. That was before the 2010 election. When we get the majority, we're going to shut down the government. That was the plan from the beginning. That was what they were promising to their own base and getting cheers for from their own base. If they got the majority, that's what they'd do. And then they got the majority, and then they followed through.
We will do what we have to do to shut down the government if we have to.
So you think even if that were to happen, theoretically, it wouldn't be as bad as people make it out?
No, I don't think it would be at all. I really don't.
Do you think shutdown should be off the table?
Everything ought to be on the table.
I got to tell you, most people in my district say shut it down. This country very well may need some sort of shock therapy.
Would it be a good thing fiscally and philosophically if the government did shut down for a few weeks and the American people could see life would go on without the federal government for a little while?
I don't think it would hurt one bit.
Even if it means, say, showing how serious we are. Okay, government's going to have to shut down.
If liberals in the Senate would rather play political games and shut down the government instead of making a small down payment on fiscal discipline and reform, I say shut it down.
Shut it down. Cut it or shut it. Cut it or shut it. That's how they campaigned for office in 2010. That's what they promised they would do if they were elected in 2010. And that is what they started to do as soon as they were elected in 2010. This was their whole idea for governance. This is their whole idea for why it's worth it to even try to have control of some lever of American governmental power. And so within a matter of weeks after they were sworn in January 2011, Republicans were giving John Boehner a standing ovation in their caucus meeting when he said, yeah, we are preparing for a shutdown. That was the first time. Hooray, a shutdown, because this is what they had promised. They weren't promising any specific result. They were just promising to use this tactic. And I think this is crucial. The tactic itself is the point. The shutdown may or may not accomplish anything. It's the shutdown itself that is the point. It demonstrates a willingness to go to extremes, which is fun and ideologically desirable. And it shows a decisive lack of respect for what government is. It is a tactical insult to the whole idea of governance. So it's just perfect for the American right, no matter what it accomplishes, even if it accomplishes nothing. The shutdown itself is the point. And so when it started to become clear that Republicans were taking over the House, look back, this was back from 2010. Ahead of the 2010 election, pundits on the right knew what they were going to get excited for. I'm almost giddy thinking about a government shutdown next year. I cannot wait. Why shut it down? Because we'll be able to. Because Republicans are about to win enough control in Washington to be able to do it. They knew that ahead of the election. And then they got elected. And now we've got, this is this week, House Republicans coming out of their closed-door meeting on Saturday when they decided to vote for a shutdown. And they did not see this as a somber thing, a sober thing that they were taking on reluctantly, a bad thing that they were reluctant to do. When they came out of that conference meeting, having just decided to shut down the government, they were psyched.
This is exactly what we hoped for. We're all getting behind leadership. We think we're going to get every vote. We're excited. We're united.
Oh, it's all good. Good plan.
How'd it go in there?
Very good. Very well.
Very well. That's great. We're shutting down the government. What could be better? They see this as great news. Reporters have been staking out the committee rooms and the meeting rooms where Republican members of Congress has been confabbing and deciding what to do these past few days, and their description of the mood among Republicans is jarring. House Republicans were ecstatic Saturday when Mr. Boehner and his leadership team presented their plan. Quote, the mood in the Capitol on Saturday, at least among Republicans, was downright giddy. When Republican leaders presented their plan in a closed-door meeting on Saturday, cheers and chants of vote, vote, vote went up. As members left the meeting, many wore beaming grins. Representative John Culberson of Texas told reporters that as he and his colleagues were clamoring for a vote, he shouted out his own encouragement. I said, like 9/11, let's roll. Let's roll. Let's bring the U.S. government to its knees, just like on 9/11, except the other way. There is a kind of palpable glee on the Republican side about this accomplishment that they are bringing about tonight. They are psyched. There is no mirror image between the two major parties. There is only one major party of the two that strives for control in government specifically because that is the place from which you can hurt government the worst. There is nothing about the last few weeks of political back and forth that explains why this is happening. There's nothing about health reform specifically that explains why this is happening. In 2011, they didn't bother making it about health reform. They made it about the budget back then. Or maybe it'll be Planned Parenthood funding, or maybe it'll be contraceptive. Let's just pick something. What we want is a shutdown. What is happening tonight because this is what Republicans want to do. This is what they promised to do. This tactic, let's roll, this tactic is an end in and of itself. And that is why there is no talking them out of it. Elect Republicans and they will burn the place down. And they will laugh while they do it and have a great time. And then what?
And now to the people who refuse to let democracy work. The people who hate government so much they've shut it down. Unable to abide by the results of democracy when they don't win, they turned on it. Republicans have now lost 3 successive elections to control the Senate, and they've lost the last 2 presidential elections. Nonetheless, they fought tooth and nail to kill President Obama's health care initiative. They lost that fight, but with the corporate wing of Democrats, they managed to bend it toward private interests. So we should be clear on this. Obamacare, as it's known, is deeply flawed. Big subsidies to the health insurance industry, a bonanza for lobbyists, no public option. And, as the New York Times reported this week, millions of poor are left uncovered by health law, largely because states controlled by Republicans refuse to expand Medicaid. As far as our bought and paid for legislative process goes, Obama's initiative made it through the sausage factory. Yet, even after both the House and Senate approved it, the President signed it, and the Supreme Court upheld it, the Republicans keep insisting on calling the law a bill, thumbing their noses and refusing to accept that it is enacted legislation. And now they're fighting to prevent it from being implemented. Here was their order of the day on Thursday from the popular right-wing blog redstate.com. Congressman, this is about shutting down Obamacare. Democrats keep talking about our refusal to compromise. They don't realize our compromise is defunding Obamacare. We actually want to repeal it. This is it. Our end game is to leave the whole thing shut down until the president defunds Obamacare. And if he does not defund Obamacare, we leave the whole thing shut down. Once upon a time, when I was a young man working on Capitol Hill, it was commonplace that when a bill became law, everybody was unhappy with it. But you didn't bring down the government just because it wasn't perfect. You argue and fight and vote, and then, due process having been at least raggedly served, on to the next fight. That was a long time ago, long before the Tea Party minority, armed with huge sums of secret money from rich donors, sucked the last bit of soul from the grand old party of Abraham Lincoln. They became delusional, then rabid, like this.
If Obamacare is ever implemented and enforced, we will never recover from it. It is an unconstitutional takings of God-given American liberty.
That's false, of course, just like those right-wing talking points that keep grinding through the propaganda mills of Fox News.
Thanks to Obamacare, doctors will be forced to ask patients about their sex life, even if it has nothing to do with the medical treatment that they are seeking at the time.
Not true.
That health care plan puts a discount on the lives of elderly people and would result in the redistribution of health away from the elderly and the infirm to other special favored interests and patients.
Again, not true. Nor is this from the multi-millionaire fabulist Rush Limbaugh.
What we now have is the biggest tax increase in the history of the world. Obamacare is just a massive tax increase. That's all it is.
That's just a tiny sample of the lies and misinformation perpetrated by the right with the song and dance compliance of its richly paid mouthpieces. Sarah Palin set the bar for truth at about ankle height with those fictitious death panels that she still insists will decide our rendezvous with the Grim Reaper.
Of course there are death penalties in there, but the important thing to remember is that's just one aspect of this atrocious, unaffordable, cumbersome, burdensome, evil policy of Obama's, and that is Obamacare.
Despite what they say, Obamacare is only one of their targets. Before they will allow the government to reopen, they demand employers be enabled to deny birth control coverage to female employees. They demand Obama cave on the Keystone Pipeline. They demand the watchdogs over corporate pollution be muzzled and the big bad regulators of Wall Street sent home. Their ransom list goes on and on. The debt ceiling is next. They would have the government default on its obligations and responsibilities. When the president refused to buckle to their extortion, they threw their tantrum. Like the diehards of the racist South a century and a half ago who would destroy the Union before giving up their slaves, so would these people burn the place down, sink the ship of state, and sow economic chaos to get their way. This says it all. They even shuttered the Statue of Liberty. Watching all this from London, the noted commentator Martin Wolf of the capitalist-friendly Financial Times says, America flirts with self-destruction. This man is the biggest flirt of all, Newt Gingrich. It was Newt Gingrich who 20 years ago spearheaded the right wing's virulent crusade against the norms of democratic government. As Speaker of the House, he twice brought about shutdowns of the federal government. Once, believe it or not, because he felt snubbed after riding on Air Force One with President Clinton and had to leave by the back door. It was also Newt Gingrich, Speaker Gingrich, who was caught lying to congressional investigators looking into charges of his ethical wrongdoing. His colleagues voted overwhelmingly, 395 to 28, to reprimand him. Pressure from his own party then prompted him to resign. Yet even after his flame-out, even after his recent bizarre race for the presidency, bankrolled with money from admiring oligarchs, even after new allegations about his secret fundraising for right-wing candidates, Gingrich remains the darling of a fawning, amnesiac media.
I'm Newt Gingrich on the right.
On CNN.com the other day, he issued a call to arms to his fellow bomb throwers. Don't cave on shutdown. At least let's name this for what it is. Sabotage of the democratic process. Secession by another means. And let's be clear about where such reckless ambition leads. As surely as night must follow day, the alternative to democracy is worse.
So the whole reason we are barreling toward the shutdown of the federal government right now is because Republicans control the House. And it's kind of a funny reason why Republicans control the House. Because in the last election, when every single one of the seats in the House was up for a vote, Democratic candidates for the House got way more votes than the Republican candidates did. Overall, in the last election, if you add up the total number of people who voted for a Democratic congressional candidate and the total number of people who voted for a Republican congressional candidate, it looks like this. Look, about 1.5 million more votes for Democrats than for Republicans. And yet, Republicans maintained control of the House. Fewer people overall voted for them, but they still won more seats. Nice trick. Here's how that looked state by state, and this is kind of nuts. In the great state of Michigan, more than 2.25 million people voted for Democratic House candidates. Just over 2 million people voted for Republican candidates. The result of Democrats getting lots more votes is that Republicans got lots more seats. The Democrats won just 5 seats and Republicans got 9. Democrats got more votes and fewer seats in Congress. Across the lake in Wisconsin, same deal. More Wisconsin voters voted for Democrats, but Republicans got 2 more seats than the Democrats did. In Pennsylvania, more people voted for Democrats than Republicans, and yet Republicans won almost 3 times as many seats as Democrats. In Virginia, Republicans got 4% more votes, okay, but they won almost 3 times the number of Democratic seats. In Ohio, same deal. Republicans won a few more votes than the Democrats did, but they won triple the number of Democratic seats. The number of Republicans and Democrats sent to Congress from states like Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Virginia and Ohio, those congressional delegations are totally out of whack with the actual statewide vote totals. And that is the point. of partisan legislatures drawing congressional districts during a census year, which was 2010, so that it takes only a handful of votes to elect people from their own party, but it takes a miracle for anybody from the other side to get elected. And the Republicans' aggressive use of that tactic after their big wins in the 2010 election, that really has two consequences for where we are right now. First, it means that Republicans as a whole really have no fear at all of them losing control of the House. The districts are drawn, so there are so many safe Republican seats in the country, they almost can't lose their majority. The other consequence, though, is this. In making sure that Republicans are representing Republican-only, Republican-safe districts, well, there'll never be any chance that they'll lose to a Democrat. Sure, it must be nice for them to fear no plausible Democratic challenger, but that also means that the real contest for their seat is in the Republican primary in their home district. And where the only thing Republicans are worried about is a challenger from their right flank, then you have Republicans who are always worried about getting as far to the right as possible. You can never waver from conservative orthodoxy. You can never have less than 100% approval from whatever conservative interest group of the moment is going to blanket your Republican district with ads calling you a squish and an Obama lover. When you tilt the playing field to give yourself an advantage, sometimes the tilting has other unintended consequences. Would we be having this shutdown fight right now if the House was not so gerrymandered to help Republicans? And what can this dynamic tell us about how this more right-wing than thou spiraling shutdown crisis might finally come to an end? Joining us now is David Wasserman. He's the editor specifically for the House at the Cook Political Report. Mr. Wasserman, thanks very much for being here.
Thanks so much. Welcome to D.C.
Thank you. It's a weird time to be here. But let me ask you about those dynamics that I just described. Obviously, I did sort of sample states there. But how is the current class of Republicans in the House different from, say, the Republicans who presided over the last shutdown 17 years ago, or interim classes?
Well, this thing is 6 or 7 beer goggles ugly right now, and there's a lot of high theater. But really, this has its roots in arcane and boring processes like redistricting and gerrymandering. And, you know, I've heard Republicans be described as fanatical, as delusional. I think they're rationally responding to the constituencies that have elected them. Blame Congress all you want. I tend to blame the voters who've gotten what they've asked for in a lot of these primaries on both sides of the aisle. And let's be honest, Democrats would have done the same thing had they won the 2010 elections as far as gerrymandering.
How much more Republican are Republicans' districts now than was normal before?
Well, check this out. Back in 95 and 96, when Republicans had 236 seats during that shutdown, there were 79 out of those 236 seats that were carried by Bill Clinton in 1992. That was many more than the 17 districts that Republicans represent that were won by Barack Obama in the 2012 election. So you're talking about going from 79 districts where there's some incentive to compromise to just 17.
Wow.
Republicans are living in a completely alternate universe from the rest of the country. Their districts are 75% white compared to 63% for the national average and 50% for Democratic districts. Consider that only 37 Republicans in the House today out of 233 were around for the 95-96 shutdown. And then you also have the fact that 48% of all House Republicans, and this blows my mind, were elected after George W. Bush left office. These people owe no allegiance to John Boehner. They ran against not only Democrats but Republican leadership to get to Congress, and they're reflecting what their primary electorates, which decided their elections back home, wanted in the first place.
So do you think that in describing the character of the sort of average House Republicans district, am I overstating it when I say that they're worried about primary challenges from their right? I mean, it may be that they're not trying to posture themselves as being as far to the right as possible. They may simply be reflecting the very unusual politics of their very tightly drawn districts.
You're absolutely right. And they're in districts that on average voted for, out of the 80 letter signers, who are essentially what Democrats would call the hostage takers.
Yeah.
Obama actually lost their districts by an average of 23 points. And so you're talking about Republicans sitting in districts, and I call this the extreme index. Fewer than a third of House Republicans in 95-96 came from districts that were at least 10 points more Republican than the national average. Today, more than half of House Republicans come from districts that are at least 10 points more Republican than the national average on the Cook Political Report's Partisan Voter Index. And so you're talking about a situation where Obama actually has negative leverage. If he comes out out and tells America that he supports one thing, that drives the incentive on the right to actually oppose things more. And so what's actually going to end this stalemate in the House? Well, I tend to think Wall Street has more leverage with middle-of-the-road Republicans in the House. And, you know, it's a marvel to think that Eric Cantor can now be considered a bellwether within the House Republican Conference, but that's where we're at. Then certainly President Obama and Democratic leadership has with House Republicans.
Yeah, and all of these appeals, especially all these sort of pundit-driven appeals to say, oh, this turns off moderate voters. There's no moderate voters that are voting in these congressional races that make a difference to these guys. It's fascinating. David Wasserman, House editor at the Cook Political Report. This is really, I think, an important part of why this is happening. Thanks a lot, David.
Thanks, Rachel.
Thanks. All right. TikTok. We'll be right back.
It's a disaster. The new reporting on what happened last year on the fiscal cliff shows that Speaker Boehner's Chief of Staff, Mike Summers, declared, we are now, the Republican majority, primarily a blocking group. In other words, that's what we're going to do, is stop things, and you see that now. And as you were talking earlier about football, you can't win just having a defense stopping things. You've got to have some sort of positive plan. And the tragedy in all of this, yes, maybe government shutdown, is that the main issues that are before the country are not being addressed. There's no tax reform being discussed. There's no entitlement reform being discussed. And the giant issue for millions of people out there is the unemployment problem is not being addressed.
I think it would be a terrible precedent to say every time you want to get something done in the Congress, you threaten to shut down the government, default on the federal debt. And you know, what's the president to do? Say, take my arm this time. In 2 months, when this CR runs out, take my leg. I think he has to draw a line here, because if this becomes the norm, then you're right. People will never have confidence in the American economy or the soundness of America's currency. I know that the night of the inauguration, 15 of them, of the leaders, primarily of the House, got together and essentially plotted, as the reporting goes, to how they could, grind the administration to a halt. I think that a lot of the people who were elected, the Tea Party Republicans who were elected in 2010, were ideologues whose mission was not just to cut deficits or stop Obamacare, but really to dismantle government.
Let's call it what it is. They are trying to blackmail the president and say, look, we're going to shut down the government or default on our debt unless we go back, rewind the clock on Obamacare and delay it or somehow cut off the funding. You can't govern that way. It will not work. It will be exposed.
If you submit to government by extortion, government by tantrum, where does it stop? If he compromises this time and, as I say, cuts off an arm, what's to stop these guys from doing it again in 2 months and saying, give me a leg?
David,
this is not the way to govern. What should the president do right now in response to this extortion racket over there? What should he do? What should his response be? I'm curious to what your solution would be.
The American economy is at stake.
I heard Ted Cruz on the Obamacare question talk about he's fighting for the poor, working poor, and the struggling people of America. In his state, there are 28% of the people who don't have health insurance. It's the worst in the country. So I don't know that they think that he's fighting for them.
This is not about going up and making deals with Republicans. This is about fighting. And my history is as a fighter and as an organizer and a negotiator.
Hi, I'm Andy Caffrey, and I approve this message.